The Conservative Party under Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has won one of the three bypoll elections which were held in the United Kingdom. What's the future of the party and the government? After a global campaign, pharma giant Johnson & Johnson, which held a vice-like grip over an important drug for tuberculosis, has reached an agreement. But is it enough? And Patrick George Zaki, a researcher, a scholar who was sentenced to 3 years in prison, has now been pardoned and released. But is this a precedent? This is Daily Debrief, and we'll be discussing all these stories. We begin with the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party avoided a whitewash as it lost only 2 of the 3 seats that were up for by-elections. These elections were held on Thursday. Now, it's a sign of how bad things are for the Tories that a victory in 1 out of 3 seats is seen as a decent outcome. But the Rishi Sunak government is increasingly unpopular due to a soaring cost of living crisis and tax regimes that have been widely criticized. Meanwhile, workers are furious at its policies. In recent times, for instance, we have seen government workers across sectors take to the streets demanding better wages. So what does this result mean for Sunak and the Tories? And what does it mean for the main opposition Labour Party? We have with us Anish. Anish, so first of all, could you take us through the 3 elections that took place on Thursday? What happened, what was expected?
Yeah, so one of the things that we need to remember about these 3 seats is that they have been very strongly conservative domains. Some of these seats have been under the conservative yoke for decades, even before the constituencies were formed, before they were joined into a single constituency, like, for instance, Somerton and Frome, or for that matter, Uxbridge and South Ruislip, which was basically Boris Johnson's seat, which they won by only a very small margin. All of these seats were bastions of Tory power or Tory popularity, and at no point they ever lost or they ever won less than 50% of the votes at any point in time. So this kind of results is by no means you can call it a decent performance by the Tory government at a time when it is still in government, and definitely very barely coming out of the whole set of scandals regarding during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw Boris Johnson skipping the entire guidelines that he himself instituted to attend Christmas parties at 10 Downing Street. So these, apart from that, you also see not a very good performance. I wouldn't say not a very great performance for the opposition Labour, in the sense that obviously they won one of the seats. A very young fellow, 25 years of age, is kind of a debutant in politics, won one of the seats, and the other was definitely won by Liberal Democrats. Now, the Liberal Democrats never won in that seat for a while now. So it wasn't really any kind of a positive vote to any one of the opposition parties. What we are looking at is a negative vote, in the sense, to the Tory administration right now, and primarily because of how badly, as you pointed out, how badly it has managed, or for that matter, mismanaged the entire economy over the past 3 years. Tories have been in power since 2010, we must remember, and right now the performance is one of the worst in history. You are seeing some record-breaking inflation. Until recently, we saw the cost of living soaring at, the inflation for cost of living soaring at about 10%, which is quite high for any of not just the OECD countries, but for any economy for that matter. And at the same time, you have wages being at a very stagnant levels, even though there have been some level of nominal growth, but it's not enough to keep up with rising inflation. So all of these factors definitely came into play. You saw different classes. Obviously, one of the seats was a rural seat, which the Labour won, obviously, and the one that Boris Johnson held, which was Uxbridge and South Ruislip, was basically a very very typically middle class Tory seat, which obviously always, the kind of class that would obviously always vote for the Conservatives. Even they have, significantly eroded in favor of other parties. And that clearly shows that there is something, very massively problematic and a massive crisis that the British population is seeing at the at the current point in time.
Right, Anish, just to sort of go through the issue of Labour, like you mentioned, it's not a huge positive vote for Labour either. And one thing many critics have pointed out is because the leadership that currently is controlling Labour, a very technocratic leadership in its own right. So could you maybe also take us through why, on the one hand, people say that Labour is maybe in a good position, but it still has its own crisis?
I mean, Labour is in a better position primarily because how badly the Conservatives are performing. That's something that we need to remember. Even when we look at Somerton and Prom, which was won by Liberal Democrats, the Labour was always third party. It was never a major group in that constituency, but it never failed to get more than 10% of the votes at any point in any of the given election in the last decade. Right now, it is performing at 2%. Although it's a by-election, voting behaviors definitely change, and there has always been this sort of anti-incumbency in sort of by-elections in the past decade or so. So it is nothing new, but definitely the kind of variation that we're seeing is definitely unprecedented. And it clearly shows that, as I said, it wasn't really a vote for any one particular party, because pretty much if you look at the economic policies and the kind of promises that they're giving, it's not very different in terms of its essence and in substance, to be very clear. Under Keir Starmer, the Labour leadership has pretty much not taken into account the sort of the working class momentum that was built under Jeremy Corbyn. That momentum is pretty much not only forgone, but they are pretty much repressed at a certain level. And under various pretenses, we see anti-Semitism being used as a common pretense, but then there are also other sort of pretenses that being used by the Starmer leadership to crack down on the more working class constituents. So that is as we talk about in terms of votes and maybe some kind of electoral arithmetics, the Labour might be at a better position, even when we consider some of the opinion polls and stuff. But the reality is that it is really not inspiring any kind of confidence among the British public, so to speak, and that is not the best of the best position for Labour to be in at this point, when obviously there needs to be a clear alternative, and everybody is pretty much angry at the government. So this is the best chance for them to. Yeah,
it's ironic because there's been this mass upsurge of public anger, working class taking to the streets in large numbers, but Labour is not very clearly taking a stand in their favour.
Exactly. Even when it comes to strikes, it's quite late in sending out its solidarities. Some of individual Labour politicians or members actually do come out, but then we do not have the party taking a clear stand very often. Or even if they do, it's slightly delayed. So it is kind of like it is lagging in actually gaining these populist support that should be by default coming to its side, but that's not happening at the current moment.
Right. Thank you so much, Anish, for that analysis. We'll keep tracking the deeds and misdeeds of the Conservatives in the run-up to the coming election next year as well. We next go to a disease which continues to destroy the lives of millions of people across the globe. That's tuberculosis. A drug known as Bedaquiline has made a major difference to TB patients over the past many years. But there is a catch. The patent for the drug is owned by pharma giant Johnson & Johnson, which means that there were restrictions on its mass production, and so many people could not get its benefits. Now the patent is expired, but Johnson & Johnson plans to use what are called secondary patents to extend its hold over the drug. After a long campaign by activists who are furious at this, a deal has been arrived. We have with us Jyotsna Singh from the People's Health Movement for more on this. Jyotsna, thank you so much for joining us. Very important issue, the question of TB drugs. So maybe for our viewers, could you first take us through what this drug is and why is it so important that we're talking about it? It's been a global campaign and a lot of activists talking about it. So why is this drug so significant in the first place?
So Bedaquiline, this is the drug which was Johnson & Johnson has had a patent and monopoly over it for almost a decade. The drug is important for quite a few reasons. Number one, it was almost for 50 years that there was no research on TB drugs and no new drug came out. So actually the drugs that we were giving to our TB patients were so old, and some of them, if they go through clinical trials today, probably would not be approved also, because they had extremely bad side effects. For example, there are injectables which are kanamycin and many others, which lead to permanent hearing loss among a lot of patients. They lead to psychosis, they lead to suicidal tendencies, and a lot of TB patients ended up committing suicides. And most of these drugs were for drug resistant TB. So a patient is also suffering more already, and they had to go through these drugs and these side effects. Injectable, the other problem is if you have to take an injection every day, then actually you lose spaces on your body where injections can be given. In fact, we've seen cases where 4-month-old babies had to be given these injections, and it was all really bad. So in that, a couple of new drugs came. One of them was Bedaquiline. So it is an oral medication. Firstly, it does not have as bad side effects. Actually, it does not have really bad side effects. It's one of the most safe drugs according to the World Health Organization, and it is to be given for lesser number of months. So the adherence of the patients is longer, because previous treatments, the one I talked about, would take 9 months to 18 months to 2 years sometimes. With Bedaquiline, it is a few months. So it does have, it is actually a game changer. It is a life-changing thing for people who have drug-resistant TB. And now, in fact, trials are being conducted to see if people who do not have resistance, the normal TB patients who we call, if they can be given the drug also.
So this is a recent drug relatively. If you look at, like you're saying, there was an old history of many drugs. Bedaquiline is relatively recent.
Yeah. So the patent came into force in 2012, I guess, and since 2016, it was started to be given to TB patients. So the clinical trials were over by then. Yeah.
So what expired now was that patent which Johnson & Johnson had. And now could you tell us a bit about what was really the controversy about?
So Johnson & Johnson has held the patent and monopoly over the drug for the longest of period, which since it came to be given to the patients, and it was a very costly drug. It was unaffordable for most of the governments to pay for, and it was not in the market. It was only through the government use that it was given. So the governments were in the developing countries were not buying in bulk. So only few patients were given the medication. And in the entire world, patients, survivors of tuberculosis, the civil society, everyone has been telling Johnson & Johnson that you stop your monopoly over this drug, let it be available, give it to the generics to produce. But well, in between, what J&J did was that they reduced the price a little, but it was still far costlier than the production price of it. That is one. The other problem also was that there is always a myth that the companies need to earn because they invest a lot in research and development. First problem, the companies never tell us how much they spent on research and development, because they know if they come clean on it, we will know that it is not as much as they claim. Number two, in the entire research and development of medicines, a lot of money is actually put by the public institutes. When the clinical trials happen, if that happens in a public facility, then that the cost is less. And in case of Bedaquiline, actually specifically, it is not only the governments, but a lot of non-governmental organizations like MSF. They also built a lot of knowledge around. They gave it to their own patients, and they told the world that it is a safe medication. So all of them are also stakeholders which companies do not care about. But if we see, actually, there was a paper which was brought out by a US-based NGO, TAG, a couple of years ago, which showed that taxpayer actually paid 5 times more than J&J in coming up with this medicine. So they have already paid for it, and then keeping the price high is criminal, so to say. So this is what had been happening. Now J&J had the patent. It was to expire across the world in July, but J&J wanted to extend monopoly, and so they have till not, they have said that they will not enforce secondary patents, which is like on the basic molecule they had the patent, but now they want to extend it for some flimsy, very small tweaks that they would have made. But then something happened because of all the pressures of the past almost 10 years of so many people. They have agreed into entered into an agreement with Stop TB. There is another NGO with them, saying that they will allow Stop TB and their global drug facility to procure medicines from generics and supply it to many countries.
Right. So basically, the generic manufacturers in some countries will be Stop TB will buy it and then supply it to other countries, and Johnson & Johnson will not enforce the patent, is what they're saying.
In those countries.
But nonetheless, Johnson & Johnson will not relinquish their monopoly, is the point.
That is an important point, because they will still be sitting, steering, the steering wheel is still in their hands. So it is a partial win in that sense, but we need to recognize it. But there are other problems also with it. Now, a lot of countries are actually out of this deal. So in this deal, so GDF, there are countries who procure from Stop AIDS GTF, but a lot of countries don't, which includes a country like South Africa, which is a very high burden country in the world. And South Africa has high burden not only of TB and drug resistant TB, but also a combination of HIV and TB, which is known to kill a lot of people also. It also excludes the entire Eastern Europe and Central Asia. It also excludes Russia, Ukraine, countries which today I think do need a lot of support in terms of health. These countries will continue to pay really high prices for the medication. And it excludes China, which is another very high burden country, again for all three, TB, DRTB and HIV plus TB. So these countries are excluded, which is a huge concern at the international level. And so what the activists are saying is that what we really need is either J&J says it will not enforce secondary patent in these countries, or these countries, the governments have to take the mantle in their hand and say that we will issue compulsory license and we will buy from generic manufacturers. And I think that is the only way to stop J&J enforcing what it wants in the field of TB and Bedaquiline, which, as we know, is a very important medicine for the TB patients.
Thank you so much, Jyotsna, for explaining this. Patent laws and all sometimes might seem very complicated. They are complicated, but I think what we often miss is that ultimately it's lives at stake, and all the legalese in the world can't really change that. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
And finally, in a rare piece of good news from Egypt, activist and scholar Patrick George Zaki has been pardoned and released. This comes a day after he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for, wait for it, writing an article. Other political prisoners, including lawyer Mohammed el-Baqer, were also released on Thursday. But many, many more remain in prison for the crime of expressing themselves and dissenting against the regime of President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. We go to Abdul for the latest developments. Abdul, a rare bit of good news from Egypt with the pardon and release of Patrick George Zaki as well as Mohammed el-Baqer. But I don't think this is really, we should read too much into it in terms of, it being a precedent for the future or anything of that sort. So could you maybe just take us, first of all, a bit about Patrick George Zaki himself, his case, and what led to the release?
Well, yeah, it is a good news, but yeah, you are also right that we should not read too much into it. The case is quite simple. He was arrested in 2020 while he was visiting his family in Egypt from Italy, where he was doing his master's, and he was arrested on the allegation that he wrote an article in which he talked about his experiences as a Christian minority, Coptic Christian minority in Egypt, which was seen by the el-Sisi regime as something against their government, attempt to spread misinformation. These were the charges against Zaki. And after spending almost 22 months in jail without his trial being completed, he was finally released on bail after a lot of public outcry over his arrest. And then finally he was basically punished. Basically, the sentence was passed earlier this week, in which he was basically for 3 years he was sentenced in prison. And after again second round of public agitation, pressure from different corners of the world, led to President Sisi finally announcing pardon and release. His release was, of course, coincided with Baqer's release also, who was basically a lawyer, who is a lawyer of Abdul Fattah, who is behind bars for almost as many years as the Sisi regime in power, and his case is still pending. Yeah.
Absolutely right. Abdul, in this context, also important to note that the so-called national dialogue has been happening, and Zaki's conviction for 3 years sentencing for 3 years had led to many of them saying that they would withdraw. So,
Exactly.
if that is also a factor, is a question.
Of course, there are two factors. Of course, one is domestic. El-Sisi is trying to regain legitimacy in Egypt, which is completely eroded because of the last 10 years of his rule. Is quite authoritarian, despite promises of preserving quote-unquote Egyptian secular ethos and reintroducing democracy. Nothing has happened. In fact, Egypt has basically slided into a complete authoritarian regime in last 10 years. And that has led to a strong popular, you can say, unrest, which is not visible, of course, on the street, but that is shown in the number of people behind pigeon in Egypt. More than 50,000-60,000 people. One can dispute the exact figure, but yeah, that is one part. Of course, there is in order to regain legitimacy, last year he started a so-called national dialogue with all the opposition forces. You can say selective opposition forces. And this conviction basically was yet another, many of the opposition forces claim that this conviction yet again proves that so-called national dialogue, so-called Sisi's attempts to democratize Egypt is all a sham. So that basically led to a kind of pressure, which basically was added with the external pressure extended by countries like Italy, where Zaki also was pursuing his higher studies and also a citizen of that country, and again some other countries in the world, which of course we should see their exerting pressure in the context of the movement which is going on for a very long time against Sisi's regime's attempts to demoralize and oppress all democratic forces in the country.
Right. Of course, Abdul, also important to note that often a question gets asked as to why is Egypt able to, or the el-Sisi regime able to do this? Why is it, its reign of repression has continued for over a decade with very little accountability? The impunity is incredible.
Exactly.
So why is Egypt so important for everybody?
Yeah.
Said nobody asks questions of el-Sisi.
Yeah. One can see that why Egypt's right-wing government was so willing to not even take any diplomatic action against its own citizen being imprisoned on Italy, we are talking about, sorry, on the apparently a false premise, and that primary reason is Egypt's geostrategic location. And everyone knows that Italy and other European countries are trying to create alternative border police across the Mediterranean. On the coast of the Mediterranean, they signed a treaty with Tunisia recently. They have some agreement with Libya. They have some agreement with Turkey as well. And Egypt also is one of the countries which basically is used by people to kind of cross and come to Europe. So Italy looks at Egypt as particularly a Sisi regime to basically initiate some kind of similar mechanism to control the flow of migrants from that country. And therefore, Italy's reactions were limited in that sense. US and other countries are so-called champions of democracy, also are quite pro-Sisi despite his record in terms of democracy and human rights and so on and so forth, primarily because of the geostrategic reasons. Egypt is one country in the entire West Asia and North Africa, which basically crucial for Israel's oppressive regimes. It implements the illegal blockade in Gaza. It basically has a friendly relationship with Israel, and it always plays a very important role whenever there is a public sentiments grows against Israel's attacks on Palestinians, Egypt comes in and kind of helps Israel to kind of regain some kind of legitimacy. So these are all, apart from these, there are other considerations, geostrategic, geopolitical consideration, which basically helps Sisi in particular to remain in power under the so-called champions of democracy in the global politics.
Absolutely. And of course, also in recent times, Sudan is also another reason why
Exactly.
countries like Saudi Arabia would want
one should
Sisi.
not forget Sudan, of
Absolutely,
course.
absolutely. And I think you very clearly explained why this amount of impunity continues. We remember during COP26, when there was a global campaign for Ala Abdul Fattah's release, Sisi just wrote it out, refused to.
Nothing happened against it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Abdul. We'll be covering, of course, other stories from Egypt also in the coming days. Thank you so much. And that's all we have time for today. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Daily Debrief. Until that, do visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, follow us on all the social media platforms, and do keep watching and reading.